Welcome back to iGen Politics. This is a podcast that makes politics engaging and relevant for all generations. This is Victor Shi. I'm currently a sophomore at UCLA, was elected as the youngest delegate for Joe Biden, and also co-host this podcast.
And I'm Jill Wine-Banks, the author of The Watergate Girl, based on my experience prosecuting the Watergate obstruction of justice case. I also co-host #Sisters-in-Law, another wonderful podcast.
As we're seeing in Russia, fake news and propaganda can have extremely detrimental consequences in society. Vladimir Putin has broadcast propaganda and cut off all other sources of the truth, so he now has a higher approval rating than before he invaded Ukraine. But disinformation isn't unique to Russia or other authoritarian countries. It's present in America. Cable news anchors like Tucker Carlson and Sean Hannity spew blatant falsehoods about everything from the COVID-19 pandemic to the invasion of Ukraine. Elected officials, former elected officials, and their followers use social media and other platforms to spread dangerous lies. These are problems that we must solve if we want to keep our republic, to quote Benjamin Franklin. Our guest today has spoken on the rise of disinformation and is on the front lines of trying to change the way in which news is presented in America to enhance truthfulness and accuracy.
She is Soledad O'Brien, currently the host of Matter of Fact with Soledad O'Brien, a nationally syndicated weekly talk show produced by Hearst Television. And I was fortunate to be interviewed by her early in the Trump administration. Soledad is also the founder and current chairwoman of Starfish Media Group, a multi-platform media production company. That is why today's #Jill's pin is a starfish. Soledad has had an extensive and diverse career in television news starting in the 90s, and she has gone on to become an anchor at MSNBC's The Site and of NBC's Weekend Today. It was a news program, and she also co-authored CNN's American Morning and their morning news program Starting Point, as well as being a frequent reporter and analyst for that channel. She also anchored the CNN documentary unit, where she created the In America series, Black in America and Latino in America. O'Brien was recognized with 3 Emmy Awards for her coverage of the Haiti earthquake, the 2012 election, and a series called Kids and Race. She was also honored twice with the George Foster Peabody Award for her coverage of Hurricane Katrina and her reporting on the BP Gulf Coast oil spill, and won an Alfred DuPont Award for CNN by her reporting on the Southeast Asia tsunami.
In 2013, Soledad became a special correspondent on the Al Jazeera news program America Tonight, and founded Soledad O'Brien Productions, where she continued to produce documentaries and series on topics that included youth incarceration, police brutality, veterans with PTSD, and the opioid epidemic. O'Brien also hosted American Injustice on BET, Shining a Light, Conversations on Race in America on A&E, and is the author of 2 books. First, The Next Big Story, and second, Latino in America. In the wake of Hurricane Katrina, O'Brien and her husband Brad created the Powerful Foundation to help young women get to and through college.
We could go on at even greater length, but let's stop here and welcome Soledad. Thank you, Soledad, for being with us today.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, so you were born and raised in a small town on the North Shore of Long Island, New York. Your parents were both immigrants. Your father is Irish-Australian, and your mother is Afro-Cuban.
That's like my life story in under 13 seconds.
We've got so much more. But they met in Maryland at Johns Hopkins University and as busy students, but married in Washington, D.C. Because of interracial marriage being illegal in Maryland. You've talked about the hostilities they endured as an interracial couple and about your older sister is being born under anti-miscegenation laws. Can you talk a little bit about how that shaped your worldview and whether it influenced your choice of documentary topics now, like those dealing with racial issues?
Yeah, it's funny. I'll answer the second part first, which is I think so. I don't think you know that it's shaped your worldview until you one day kind of look and think like, wow, this is so interesting to me. And so I do think my parents both being children of kind of the Depression era, they didn't back in the day, people didn't like blog and vlog about their deep, feeling. Like if something was difficult, you just kind of kept a stiff upper lip and you just didn't talk about it. To get my parents to share about their experience in an interracial marriage when I was writing my memoir in 2010 was literally like pulling teeth. Like you would have thought, it just was not their way. They just didn't really talk about it a lot. But I do think, certainly growing up in a community that was not racially diverse, and then kind of experiences that I had, mostly good, but as a reporter early on, where you could see the hierarchy of the stories that mattered and the stories that generally did not matter were community stories. Read, brown and black people, health centers opening, things that I look back now and think those are actually really important to the integrity, if you will, of a community, right? Like how a community holds together. But they, in the newsroom, early in my career, just didn't have a lot of value. And so I think it did shape for me kind of my parents' experiences, partly because we just had a different upbringing. We just had a different upbringing. I always thought like, well, my story is as interesting as anybody else's. It's just different. And you kind of start interviewing people and realizing like, well, that's an interesting story. And it's a very American story. It's a very Long Island story or Boston story where I met, or San Francisco where I worked, or San Francisco story where I worked. And yet the people in it are very different and their stories are very different. So I do think being an outsider sometimes is very helpful to how you think about what stories can resonate.
And those community stories are definitely ones that we want to get into later on in the podcast. But I want to maybe go back to your early years. You started at Harvard in 1984, left for a gap year that turned into many years, and then returned while pregnant with your first child to earn your degree in English literature and culture in 2000. And during that gap, you also started your television career, first at WZ TV in Boston. How long were you gone, and what was your intent when you took that leave of absence?
Yeah, I had been pre-med in college. In fact, I'd been pre-med since I was a teenager. So I did everything that would check the box for someone who was going to interview you for med school, right? Which was, I worked as a candy striper. I worked in a nursing home. I worked in a pharmacy, right? And then I got to med school. Then I got to my pre-med courses in college, and I was actually taking organic chemistry with my sister, who's a surgeon now. So one of us made it, one of us did not. And I remember taking this class, and she said to me, you always memorize so much. Why do you do that? You should be able to deduce these formulas. Like if you're really a scientist, you'd understand the formula well enough to be able to deduce it, if that makes sense. And this formula was not this, but it was like y equals mx plus b, the formula for a line. You have an xy axis, b is a variable in space. Like what else could it be? Like you should understand a formula so well that you get it. And I had no idea what she was talking about. I understood that was a big gap for me. I didn't understand. I had a very good ability to memorize, regurgitate, and move on, whether it's vocabulary words or whatever. And it kind of dawned on me wow, maybe this is not for me. And maybe I'm not really passionate about it. She would go on to be a researcher and a scientist and a physician. And I was like, I don't really know what I want to do. I'm not sure what I'm passionate about. So I left. And I remember people often ask me were my parents freaked out by it, which they really weren't. And I think a lot of that was because there was, if you knew my parents, you would know there was no way I was going to sit on the couch and eat Fritos all day. That was not going to happen. I immediately had a job. I started working in Boston. I went and started working at a TV station. So I think they would have been upset if I was if they ran into me on the couch every day coming in and out of work. But they didn't. I was working right away, and I liked working in TV news. I didn't really know it very well, but I had an internship, and I was actually working at Harvard Summer School as well. So I had housing for the first part of it. And I was like, oh, I'm actually good at this. I like this. And my pre-med background helped me get my first job because I understood a lot about sort of how medicine worked. So it was very helpful kind of in the macro, but I decided really that medical school would not be for me. I ended up weirdly being successful. Successful in fetching coffee at WBC TV and then helping write scripts, and I could move up the ladder. And so by the time I was pregnant with my first child, which was in 2000, I guess 1999 he was born in 2000. My best friend was my boss at the Today Show. And she said, you're anchoring the Weekend Today Show. You should go back to college. Once you have a kid, it's much harder. And also, you only work weekends for the most part. You could actually make this work. So we kind of negotiated with Harvard. NBC was willing to pay for it, which was amazing for my last semester. And I was able to finish my degree. So it all kind of worked out. But really, it was Kim saying, don't leave it unfinished. Once you have a baby, it all just gets much more complicated. And she was right about that. So I was really glad that I was able to finish up.
You were actually one of 6 in your household to go to Harvard. Did any of them take similar paths, or were you the only one who kind of went down this trajectory of gap year in journalism?
Yeah, I think all of us did different things. So, for example, my sister Maria went to undergrad at Harvard, then she went to Yale Law School. So she had a very straightforward path. And my sister Cecilia started off at Stanford, didn't really like California, transferred over to MIT, went to Harvard Law School. And then my brother Tony was next, and he went to Harvard and then Harvard Law School. And then I think he had a job in the law, and he was like, I don't love it. And so he kind of started his own business, not really doing law, informed by law, I would say. My sister Estella got her MD and I think she got her PhD too, and her master. So everybody's kind of taken a different bit of a path. And I think my parents, who were very interested in education, were also very good at make sure you're doing what you want to be doing as you're going. They never were. I have some friends whose immigrant parents are very much like, you must be a doctor. And they were never like that. They were much more, you must be a good person. Like, don't be a jerk. And also make sure you're fulfilled, because life is short, and who wants to do something they don't want to do? So I think we all took a little bit of different paths. My brother, who ended up going to Yale undergrad and then Harvard Med School, he had never taken any pre-med courses. So after he finished at Yale, he had to go take a gap year I think he was studying politics. So he had to take a gap year or 2 to get all his pre-med requirements done. So everybody kind of has a different path. And I think that's life, frankly. I think, if you're fortunate enough, he had a lot of loans that he had to repay eventually, because med school is expensive. But I think if you're lucky enough that every step of the way, you have good guidance, and you're saying like, ugh, I don't want to do this. Ooh, I do want to do that. And it's actually one of the reasons that my husband and I run a very tiny foundation that sends girls to school, because you need second chances and you need third chances, right? And you get to make stupid mistakes, and you get to say, oops, I guess this was not the right decision. I need to go do something else. And I was really lucky. Again, intact family, middle class, parents who had very solid, boring ass jobs, but, meaning that you had no drama, right? There was no fear that someone was going to get fired. There was no fear of losing your job. It was just very dull all the time. And I think there's a real value in being in a very tight-knit household that's just kind of boring.
I think for so many of my generation listening to that, it's going to be helpful. And I'm wondering what your advice is when it comes to gap year. Do you think more young people now should consider taking a gap year or years?
Oh, yeah. Oh, definitely. Oh, 100%. I think it has to be a gap year with a purpose. Like, literally, if you're going to sit on a couch and catch up on all the Netflix shows that you missed during the pandemic, then don't do it, because that's just a waste of time. But I think if you're going to take a class or get a job, any job, I think there's so much to be learned by kind of getting out there. When I went back to college for my last semester, I was so much smarter about how the world worked. I had to write papers when I was covering the Elian Gonzalez story in Cuba, and FedEx my papers to my TA, who was a solid 10 years younger than me. I was a much more responsible and thoughtful human being. And I understood what community and neighborhood meant, all things that, as a middle class kid in Long Island, I really don't think I had a good, I could wrap my head around. So I would say, yeah, take a gap year if it's worthwhile. And worthwhile can be you work in a restaurant and you save some money. It doesn't have to be I worked at this prestigious fill in the blank firm. It just can't be I sat on the couch and did nothing, because I don't think that's really a valuable way to spend your time.
It's so interesting listening to you, because I started out in occupational therapy, and I dropped out. I did, but I dropped out, not for the reason you did. I dropped out because I realized I'd have to cut up a cadaver in my second year. And
I was good at
couldn't.
that. I was actually
Really?
good at that. I did not mind that. I'd done a number of stories on autopsies and I was so into it. So it didn't bother me. That part was not bad. And some people had a lot of aversion to blood. Not me, totally fine with it. It was just like the math and the formulas seems to be important in science.
Sounds like your gap year was very beneficial because it got you into journalism, which
Yeah.
seems to have blasted. Was WBZ your first exposure to journalism? And was it by happenstance that you ended up there? Or was it, gee, I think I might be a good writer, I might be a good communicator, I should try some media?
A little bit of both. Harvard has a book called The Harvard Guide to Careers, and it's about this thick. Doesn't it sound insane? And I went through it, and I'm like, physics professor, no. Astronomer, no. And so I was looking at advertising media, and I was like, oh, I think it might be interesting to try journalism. I'm a good writer. I was an English literature major, and so I knew that would be a strength of mine. I just sent out a bunch of applications. So happenstance was that at WBZ, they were looking for an intern at a Spanish language show called Centro, which actually just went off the air. So I was one of their early interns, actually. And it wasn't journalism at all. I mean, it was covering a community, but it wasn't like a newsroom. And so when I got a chance to run down to the newsroom to run errands or bring a message to someone or do this or that, I love the newsroom. And I love the newsroom because I love that it was like chaos and you had to kind of hit this deadline, but then it was over. Good show or bad show, great show or a horrifically terrible show. Like you start again tomorrow. And there was something very appealing about that. So it was a bit of happenstance because WBZ was looking for an intern in their Spanish language show, of which I speak Spanglish. So I'm not sure how I got that internship. And I really speak Spanglish, so I'd never lie about that. And I, my internship was getting coffee and working on various shows, and I loved it. I really loved it, but I loved being down in the newsroom. And so when I applied for a production assistant job in the newsroom, and I had spent enough time in there that I was able to get that job.
So I also was wondering, based on looking at a couple of your tweets, whether your mother influenced you, because there's one tweet that I'm going to read to you. It says, "When my mom died, I found this letter to the editor among her possessions. She's calling out John Klein, the town supervisor in Long Island, for his racist housing policies. I think it's from the 1970s. It inspires me to name names and call out BS. Don't live afraid." And it seemed to me that there must have been some lesson that you got from your mother that has helped you in journalism or may have guided you to journalism.
My mom was so hardcore. You would love her. She would love you, and you would love her. She would love you, Victor, because she loved young people, and she loved to be like, "Let me tell you." My mom was very tough, and I used to think. One, she embarrassed me horribly, right? Because you had this Black Latina lady in an all-white neighborhood who would speak up and sing out loud, and the more you were embarrassed by her, the louder she got. And only in retrospect did I realize, like, she spent a lot of time fighting. And I think it's exhausting to fight all the time. But my mom really was that person, like, to write an op-ed that calls out the town supervisor for being racist in the 1970s is insane. We lived in an all-white neighborhood. Like, it just wasn't done. It just wasn't done. And my mom's own advice to us, to some degree, was like, put your head down. It's a good public school. You don't need to date anybody here. You're here to get a good education. Put your head down, mind your business. But I think she also was just very aggressive about calling out the things that she thought were wrong. And so, yeah, my mom had my mom was also nuts. I mean, she had great advice, So a lot of her advice was, if you wanted to find a man, you should go to church. Why was I not going to daily mass? I was named after the Virgin Mary. My name is Maria de la Soledad Teresa Marchetti O'Brien, which is roughly the Virgin Mary, as you can imagine. But she also was kind of hardcore about, being self-sufficient and if people didn't believe in you, moving on. And if something was going wrong, suck it up. And if you were sad about something, take 24 hours and cry about it, like full on boo-hoo in bed, eating Ben and Jerry's, and then hour 25, get your butt out of bed and come up with a list and like, where are we going? Because to me, at least, that was very much like the immigrant mentality. There was just, there was no laying in bed like, oh, I just don't know. It was, you can be sad, but now today we need to move forward. And it was a very helpful way to grow up. My parents were also, I ended up, when I was working at CNN, I did a lot of coverage on race, and I would meet so many young women of color who were biracial, like me. My dad was white, my mom was black, and they were so conflicted about it. It was so interesting. My parents never, my parents were like, you're black, like you just are. And so my mom used to say, don't let anybody tell you you're not black. Don't let anybody tell you you're not Latina. And I'm like, I'm in an all-white neighborhood. No one's saying that, crazy lady. Like, they're saying the opposite of that. Can I touch your hair or whatever? So I used to think she was literally insane until I started reporting on race. And then people would say, well, why do you get to tell that story? Who are you? What's your background? So my parents, I think it was very developmentally helpful to kind of have a very strong sense of who you are, if that makes sense. And I always felt so badly for young women who would say, I just don't know who I am. I'm like, you're black. Look at you, you're black. I don't care if your white dad raised you. And you are a young, gorgeous black woman. And that's cool. Be happy with it and move forward. I never had that sense of like, I'm lost and I don't know who I am. And I'm so grateful for my parents and really my mom for being like, this is it. This is who you are.
Good upbringing for sure. So let's go back to at WBEZ. It's a local television station. And Victor and I have often talked about local news and its importance and how often it is ignored and not given.
It's a real resurgence now. Local news is doing great. Local news is doing great.
Tell us what you think in terms of, one, in terms of career, is it the right place to start? But also its importance in this media field that we now have and why we need local news, not just national.
Yeah, journalism right now I think is a mess, and national political journalism is a big giant mess. And local news is really seeing a resurgence. And I think a lot of news organizations are very much paying attention to serving their community. It sounds almost cheesy, but for me, when I covered Hurricane Katrina, it sort of dawned on me like, oh, this is not a story about a storm, right? This is about failures of helping people humanely. And my job was to like, how do we get information out? How do we bring context to this story? And how do we tell this story? And I think local news has long done that. Here's a story that affects our people right here. And our job is to serve them here. And I always think that there was a real clarity in working at WBZ that I didn't sometimes have in cable news, because in cable news, it often felt like you were chasing the drama of a story. So local news is really important, and it really encourages me. We've lost a lot of local reporting. Newspapers are really challenged right now, but I think it's really, really important. And I think there's a real resurgence, certainly in local TV news, because I think they're really doing a good job serving their audience. I loved working at WBZ, and it taught me a lot about like, how do you tell a story well and thoughtfully and clearly? My advice would be to young people who are looking for jobs in journalism is take any job that's going to pay you cash money to do the job. Early on, you don't need to be picky. You can just say, I want to learn, and I want to learn at a place that's going to teach me, whether it's a big place, I worked at networks, whether it's a small place. I think you just have to get in there, kind of keep your mouth shut, and really figure out the lay of the land and figure out, like, what can I learn here? Some jobs you're in, you realize, like, wow, I can't learn anything. When I was in local news at KRON TV, I wanted to learn how to anchor. My boss at NBC, Bob Bazell, said, you should learn how to anchor because MSNBC was just starting, and there were opportunities in newsrooms if news broke because there were no cable stations yet, or ones that were connected, like NBC didn't have its cable channel. That meant that whoever was the highest ranking correspondent had to go sit in front of the camera and say, so-and-so's been shot, or this plane has crashed, or whatever. I mean, it was terrifying. If you didn't anchor, imagine someone saying, Jill, guess what? Sit in front of the camera. You're now anchoring for the next 3 hours. So he said, get experience. And so in San Francisco, I asked them if I could learn how to anchor. And they said, no, we got a lot of women. We're not interested. And it was the first time probably in my career, and it would happen a few more times, where when you realize you're surrounded by people who don't see growth for you, that you kind of have to be like, thank you. Thank you for the clarity. Now I need to get my resume together and think about where I'm going to go. But there's always opportunities to learn. And then it becomes clear, like the opportunity to learn has stopped. And now I have to go to another place to make sure I can keep growing. I always thought about my career as like growing my skill set, so that when you made a move, you were a little bit terrified because you had sold them on a thing that you were not really sure you could do. Sure, I can do that, And so I think that that's always the goal, to keep growing your skill set. And anytime you're in a place where people are like, nope, you're good, like right where you are is where you need to stay. I mean, who wants that?
Exactly. And I love that they said to you, no, we have a lot of women. I only wish that I had ever heard that in any place I ever worked.
Yeah.
It hasn't. But anyway, you did then move from local to national. You went to NBC and eventually to MSNBC, and then you have a long career in many other networks as well. And when you left local news and went to a network, originally I think it was with a local affiliate of NBC, is there anything that you wish you had known, or are you glad that you just went there and took the chance?
Oh my God, I'm so glad the internet really did not exist. It just started. So I think social media was not a thing at that moment, because the pressure on people to be new and to mess up and brutal. No, I think there's a real value sometimes in being naive, and because if you knew more, you'd probably be more afraid. But by being, my very first live shot, I was in a bar. They sent me to cover the San Francisco Giants in a bar game, watching the game with other people who were also not going to the game. We were all in a bar. And I didn't realize that you should never, ever set up a live shot where people have access to your backside. Like, I'd never done a live shot before. I'd been with them like 3 days, and they had promised I wouldn't have to do a live shot for the first couple of weeks. I'd been a producer at NBC. I hadn't been on air. So my first on-air thing, I realized you're in a bar, so everyone's drinking and they're drunk and they're watching a game. I had no idea until I started talking, and I was like, everybody's really drunk. And boy, are they standing close to me. And this man has just pinched me in the rear end. Obviously now, because those big lights, people gather up behind you, and you never would do that again. But yeah, I think there is a value to learning things and not being, to kind of figuring it out on your own and navigating your own path. When I worked at CNN, for example, when I was new at CNN, I had just had my twin boys. So I'd been there maybe a year or so. And I had 4 kids under 4. And I was sent to go cover the tsunami, Southeast Asian tsunami. And I went to go do a special, but I was also anchoring the morning show. And the producer I was signed to when I got to Thailand said to me something like, I know you're a big star for CNN, but I need to tell you, if you can't hack this, I'm going to put you on a plane home. I was like, I am 38 years old. It sounds like I was 14, And I was so upset. And I remember calling back to my husband and crying, because I'm a big crier when I get upset. I cry all the time. And he gave me great advice. He was like, listen, I don't think there's anything you can do except put your head down and do the gig. Like, just do it. What are your options? What are you going to do? Call your bosses and say someone's being mean to me? And it was a really good moment to kind of like learn how to navigate through really crummy experiences. It turned out we ended up doing the special. And because Thailand is 12 hours ahead, I could shoot for the special and then come back to the hotel and shoot my show, which went from 6 to 9 p.m., which is 6 to 9 a.m. in New York. And so I was doing double duty, and it went very well. And I think his advice was exactly right. Like, sometimes the only option is to kind of hit a home run. Like, you can talk a good game, but you just got to do the work of it. And I thought that was very good advice.
Sounds like you were an early Ali Velshi, who's doing exactly that now, where he's overseas covering the war. and anchoring.
Yeah, he's amazing. And he's a great example, actually. He's just good at his job. And he doesn't think of it as like, I do this and I don't do that. Ali has we work together at CNN, and he's very smart, but he's also like, he just does stuff. Like, he's just good at just working. And some people like just put the work in, and he's a very good example of, he just puts the work in.
Let's maybe talk more about your time at CNN as a co-anchor of American Morning, which was their flagship morning program. And I'm wondering specifically about whether you see a difference between nightly news programs at cable networks and daytime news shows.
Yeah, for sure. It wasn't the same as it is now. Now the nightly news programs are very opinion heavy. It really wasn't that way when I started at CNN in 2003. They had a pretty strong standards and practices wall. So if you started spouting your opinion, that just was not a thing back then. And I think today those shows are really 99.9996% opinion. I always like doing morning shows versus evening shows because I think in my mind, I love the idea of how you would frame your interviews was always, good morning, here's what you missed overnight. And it really helped me figure out, like, because I would fill in a lot. Anderson did an evening show, other people did evening shows. And it was much harder because the news had, it just kept rolling through. But I loved being kind of the big morning show because we were the starting point for everybody starting their day. And it just in my head helped me think about how to frame my questions and what stories we wanted to cover and how we wanted to inform people. And back to that idea of like, this job is about educating and informing people and giving them some clarity in what's happening. By the time you get to the 99th time the story has been told and this guest has actually been on 68 times, for me, I've always found that a bit challenging.
Do you think that model of having more opinionated news shows at the evening times is a good model or a bad one?
I don't think it's interesting for me personally, and I think you live by the sword, you die by the sword. Exhibit A, Chris Cuomo. I think that was a real mistake in a lot of ways. Chris interviewing his brother was a journalistic no-no. It's just not done. No more than I would interview my own brother, who would be like, why am I on TV? But if he were the governor, right? Everyone would say it's just not done that way. The way you would do that is you would say, Jane Doe will do the interview with the governor, and then I will debrief her on my show. There's a distance so that there's real journalism. So you don't give the appearance of impropriety. And I think what they did was not just have Chris interview his brother, but they kind of had a dog and pony show about talking about mom and this. It was just silliness, again, around a story that was quite important. They weren't talking about Groundhog Day and it was a funny moment, once a year. It was like, we're talking about a pandemic and people dying in a pandemic. I don't think this should be a dog and pony show, but you live by the sword, you die by the sword. And I'm sure in retrospect, people think like, well, that was a big mistake in a lot of ways. So I personally am not a big fan of opinion because sometimes I think the reporters play it up in order to come across as tough or come across as, they push back hard, when actually I just want to understand the story. The show that I do now, for matter of fact, has been kind of interesting. We don't do opinion at all, but it's been interesting because we have found that viewers want to understand things. Like, can you explain how Watergate, Jill was on our show, how Watergate is like what we're hearing today, right? They actually want context. They don't need Soledad O'Brien to give her their opinion. I mean, they can certainly go to my Twitter page. I give a lot of opinions, but I think they want to understand an issue from the people who had important, central roles in it, and people who are experts. And that's what I want. I want to hear from experts. Experts I might agree with, experts I might disagree with, but they have a certain level of expertise. And I think we've really seen kind of the death of experts in a way where, anybody, I'm a mom and here's what I think about the global pandemic. Come back to me when you're an epidemiologist. I'm happy to hear from you. So I think that's been very problematic. We have found some of our best shows have been, what's the First Amendment? A deep dive into gerrymandering, bringing solar power to Puerto Rico. We had millions of viewers for an entire show that looked at how Puerto Ricans in the wake of Hurricane Maria had decided that they actually were going to kind of save themselves the next time around because the power grid is so iffy there. And they were going to be responsible for bringing their own solar power. That show did great. I can't imagine going into a news director and being like, I've got a story. solar power and put like it wouldn't happen. But the stories that we do usually cut out the politicians and we kind of go straight to the people. So we don't really deal with the middlemen talking about, here's the legislation I'm pitching. It's more like here are people and their stories. And I have found that when you present it that way, you don't have as much partisan yelling, right? Like if you're talking about insulin and how expensive it is, it doesn't really matter your politics. I mean, it's expensive for everybody. So we have found that it's not two people yelling at each other. You're an idiot, Congressman. You're an idiot, Senator. It's like, let's explain why these prices are what they are. Let's talk about the housing crisis and how this person is dealing with it. And I have found that, again, focusing on journalism as explainers and helping people understand an issue so much more valuable than two politicians who are clearly, trying to raise money when they run the clip on social media. It just feels like such a big waste. So yeah, I'm not a big fan of opinion in any way, shape, or form in the newscast.
Mm-hmm. And it really allows the audience to understand the story better, like you said, and go beyond those 5-10 minute kind of segments on cable news. And I'm wondering, so first, do you think that there should be more long form pieces on cable news? Is that possible? And second, do you think my generation can handle long form pieces?
Yes, first of all, your generation definitely can, because you people screen Netflix and binge so clearly. Long form pieces are just expensive. They're just here's the issue. They don't want to pay for that. If I do a contract with a lawmaker so that they're an official talking head, I'm paying them maybe $100,000 a year, right? And now they're on every show. So for $1 million, I can fill my day in and day out. It doesn't cost me that much money. For me to go shoot a good story is probably at least $25,000, between crews and travel and time and talent. It's expensive. So it's a lot, it's a lot more money. So you're really investing more money. And so sure, networks could do it. CNN made a big, massive profit. Fox makes big, massive profits. It requires reporting. It requires money. And sometimes people don't want to pay it. So they don't. But, that's really the issue. I have found that young people love podcasts, young people love documentaries, young people love 12-part Netflix series, young people love, so I don't, there was this myth, you're probably a little too young to realize it, but there was a show called 48 Hours. And the whole idea behind 48 Hours was like fast cuts, that now everybody needed everything. No edit could be longer than somewhere between 3 and 8 seconds. So it was always like, choo, 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 swish pan, and that's what people needed to see, because your audience would be bored if you didn't have that. And you actually find now, good storytelling is really what compels people. And good storytelling about anybody. There's also a myth. Black people want to watch Black people. Latinos want to watch It's not true. People want to understand a good story. And we see so many examples of that, but yet those myths seem to persist.
I hope you're right. But there is one other thing that seems to sell and make money for at least Fox News, and that is disinformation.
And conflict. Really, it's disinformation wrapped in conflict, right?
Yeah, although there's no conflict on Fox. They have only one opinion, it seems to me. And a lot of it is it's certainly not based on what I would consider facts. And there is only one set of facts. I actually remember back when there was agreed upon facts on every network. There were only 3 back then, and they all had the same facts. Politicians might disagree about the policy implications, but there was only one set of facts. And now we're so far from that, where those people who watch MSNBC believe A, and the people who watch Fox believe the exact opposite. So what is it that we can do in the media environment to bring facts back into existence, to get all Americans to be able to evaluate what is true and make decisions based on truth?
Yeah, it's a really big problem. A guy, I sit on the board at RAND Corporation, and Michael Rich, our CEO, wrote a great book that's called Truth Decay. And it really looks at, I mean, Rand does a lot of research, right? So they're basically fact finders, and they do all this research around policy. So he writes, along with Jennifer Kavanaugh, who's his co-author, they write about seeing this decay in this idea of like, there are facts. We might disagree on implications. We might even disagree on issues, but there are certain undeniable facts, and we're moving away from that. That's the $64,000 question, and I don't know. I mean, it's done very intentionally. It's not like, oops, somehow they keep stumbling on misinformation and disinformation, and they just don't realize it. It's done with tremendous intention, and I think the conflict is in having a boogeyman, right? Having you want to have people. Even if the conflict isn't within two people fighting, it's a sense of conflict constantly, right? The world is changing, it's different, it's upsetting. It's never, let's explain this. It's always this idea of, is there a pedophilia ring in the basement of a pizzeria that doesn't have a basement kind of thing? And it's insane, but you're at a really crazy time. So I don't know how to answer that because I don't know how to fix it. It's not unintentional. I think you would have a better chance of fixing it if it were just accidental, if it were just mistakes or misinformation. But it's disinformation. And there are people who benefit from it. And there are politicians who benefit from it tremendously. So there's no real incentive to say, you know what, we really need to buckle down and fix this. And there are platforms that, let me promise you that Facebook benefits from having big streams of disinformation, and they platform it all the time. So I think once people benefit from something, it makes it very hard to end it.
I'm sort of hopeful that some of the lawsuits, the Smartmatic and Dominion lawsuits, which could cost Fox dearly for perpetuating lies that they knew were lies, could actually pull them back from the brink of continuing to be a propaganda tool for Russia. I mean, right now you have Tucker Carlson being broadcast in Russia because he's very helpful to their cause. He's spouting their propaganda. And you've not been quiet. You've been quite outspoken in criticizing CNN and MSNBC. And so tell us a little more about your criticism and what you think they could do to improve.
Yeah, and all networks, right? I mean, to some degree, I had the chance to testify before Congress, which, interestingly, I mean, you, Jill, done a lot of testifying, but I have not. Probably a good thing. But you can't move when you do the remote test. Like, you have to sit in your chair for 4 hours, which was a lot. But we did something on misinformation and disinformation, and it was I was very interested in taking part in it. But at the end of the day, people benefit from it, right? People who know better. So, I mean, Fox does it for sure, but CNN platforms liars. They give them, and they don't frame them because they benefit from having them on the air. And again, I think it's because it gets into this dynamic of conflict. I know anchors love to give the sense that they're tough when they're challenging someone. And in many cases, they're not very good at challenging somebody. But my basic rule of thumb is if someone intentionally lies to me, they don't come back on the air. Every politician is going to spin, is going to exaggerate, right? But I'm talking about an absolute lie to your face. I just don't have them back on. If someone lies, they don't get to, you do not, and you also do not need to give a live mic to people. I don't know where this sense of like everybody gets a voice. It's like, no, we make decisions day in and day out about who gets airtime and who does not every day. The New York Times likes to claim, we don't make the news, we just cover it. It's like, right, but you make decisions. It's a zero-sum game. There's a certain amount of space, and you make decisions every day. This is important, goes here. This is not important, we don't have space for it, goes over there, right? Like we all do. Every newsroom makes that decision. So you don't have to give everybody airtime live. You can say, this person's a newsmaker. They're very important. However, they're often full of shit. So what we're going to do is we're going to interview them, we're going to tape it, and then we're going to make sure that what they're telling us is actually factually accurate, right? And they can have opinions, but when they start to lie, we actually are not going to put that on TV because we don't put, liars on TV. And I think, and CNN does that as well as as well as MSNBC, and as well as, Fox does it as a business model. So there are many things you can do. The problem is it's intentional. It's intentional. It's not an error. It's not a mistake. It's not I didn't realize he was lying. It's, I understand this is a person who doesn't think the election was valid, and yet I'm going to give them 6 minutes of airtime on this Sunday morning on Meet the Press. That's a decision. That's what they've decided to do.
And you've raised an issue which has been of concern, which is Ukraine, and what's happening there is of critical importance, and we need to know, we need to see. But there also needs to be some balance, and so there's been criticism that there hasn't been enough attention paid to conflicts in other areas, the Middle East, Africa, the world is
What's the
hungry.
difference? Let me think for a minute. Oh, right. The brown people seem to get less coverage than all those reporters who are telling us that these people are Europeans and they're not used to, they're civilized people. The funny thing about all of that, and I think overall the reporting has truly been excellent, but there are some standout terrible people who, were informing us how these people were civilized. These white people that you're seeing, they're not used to this stuff because they're civilized. That's a quote. I'm not making that up, right? That there are certain people for whom this is just so stressful because they're not used to this stuff, where those people over there, if they're African and if they're Middle Eastern, well, they're basically savages, and they get what they get. And so, yeah, listen, unfortunately, I've been around the block enough to know that, racism isn't really embedded. I was embarrassed for these reporters because you actually see it, right? You're like, wow, you are telling us I got to be careful with what I say, and then you're not very careful with what you say around, who you think is valuable and who do you think gets airtime. We just finished a doc series that's streaming on HBO Max right now called Black and Missing, and it was exactly this. Like, why are the Black women who are missing are just not seen as compelling stories, but the young, pretty white women who are missing are seen as very important stories, to the point where the nation will go on a hunt for that young woman, which, by the way, is good. I'm glad that people are helping search for missing girls. My question is always, what is it in newsrooms that people say, yeah, but this person, I don't know, not so interesting to me, but this person, wow, this is interesting. I mean, it was Gwen Ifill who coined the term, missing white girl syndrome, right? This idea that, some people are more valuable. And I think newsrooms consistently show us, and sometimes the reporters actually tell you in their live shot, like, these people are valuable, right? They're not savages. They just aren't used to this kind of stuff. And it's very, of course, no one should be used to it. And everybody's crisis and everybody's chaos and everybody's trauma, which you're seeing unfolding, should be covered because they're human beings. I find it very upsetting and very challenging.
So I hope everyone will watch your HBO documentary, and we will put its name up on our in our show notes.
I appreciate that. Thank you. Yeah, we just won a big award. We won an Independent Spirit Award the other day. My husband, who's not in TV, was like, is this a big one or is it not a big one? I'm like, this is a big one. And an NAACP.
Yes.
Yeah, and an NAACP award as well for our director.
Wow.
So yeah, it's a really wonderful doc series. The doc series is called Black and Missing, and it focuses on two women who started the Black and Missing Foundation to literally help communities of color figure out how to get the attention of the media and of law enforcement, because they're often ignored when people in those communities go missing.
Wow, that's amazing. So against the backdrop that we've been talking about, you're actively working to help reform how news is presented, and you haven't been afraid to point out the misinformation and bad framing of cable news organizations. I'm wondering, what have been some of your favorite documentaries to work on at Starfish, which is the media company that you now own and manage?
Thank you. Yes. I have always really enjoyed projects where you get to tackle kind of current day issues. So I don't know if you guys have been watching, I think it's on HBO. It's The White Lotus. Have you seen that show? Have you seen it? Oh my gosh, it's amazing. You have to watch it. But what's great about it is that they really have a very nuanced approach to, like, modern day conversations about race and class and have not. And it's a really creative way to do it. It's very interesting. It's not lectury or boring. And so I think for our docs, some of them are just really fun to do. We did a doc that is on Discovery called Prison Breaker, about a guy who's literally broken out of state and federal prison. He's now in Supermax. And every time he would break out of prison, he would FOIA his case so he could figure out what he had done wrong for the next time. So crazy. And so telling his story, and he would videotape himself on the run in Canada. Thank you for my documentary. We needed that video. And so we tell the story of how he really went from a really promising life to be killing a guy and then going on the run and escaping from prison. And he was kind of, it's one of those cases where you have a person who's almost a genius in the bad thing that they do. Like, you hate to say a genius, but like in terms of breaking out, he is a genius. So we did that project. We did a really interesting project that called Disrupt and Dismantle, which was a great way to explain to people like what's environmental racism, which I will confess, even I didn't fully understand. When we started, people often will talk about it. I'm like, right, I don't exactly get that. So we wanted to talk about, environmental racism and just and different issues and who's working to disrupt and dismantle some of these systems that were in place. So, for example, I went to, it wasn't outside of Dallas. This woman said that she had a mountain of shingles. In fact, she called it Shingle Mountain in her backyard in Dallas. People started illegal dumping of shingles. And she's like, I have a mountain of shingles. Now, I assumed it was kind of like, a mountain of shingles is like that, like a big giant pile. 10 stories high.
Oh my gosh.
Gosh.
Like a hotel size of shingles. I pulled up on her house. I'm like, oh my gosh. And it had all been illegally dumped. And we wanted to tell the story about how people in certain communities were just subjected to illegal dumping, even when some of the politicians were like, we didn't know. I'm like, really? It's kind of the size of a 10-story building. I don't believe you. So I've always felt like I've had great opportunities to do stories that I think are important, that I think are compelling. They've got to obviously be entertaining and beautifully shot, but it's nice when you work for yourself, you get to pick and choose what you get to do. And you also get to pick and choose the people you work with. And I do think for younger people, sucking it up is a very good skill. You will get a lot of opportunity and you'll learn a lot. If you keep your mouth shut and plow forward, there's a lot to be learned. But when you get to my age, which is now 56, to be able to say, here are the projects I want to do. Here are the people I want to work with. Here's the quality of work that I want. Here's what I want to do. Here's how much I want to travel. It's really refreshing and freeing to work on those projects.
We want to talk more about the Disrupt and Dismantle documentary series, but before we do so, I'm just wondering, how do you make those decisions? You talked about the intentionality of cable news organizations. How do you do it at Starfish?
Yeah, a lot of it is what's funded. I mean, there's a lot of things that I'd love to do, and they're like, no, nobody wants to pay for that. So, nope, you're not doing it. And sometimes you're not doing it now. But we run a production company, and in order to be a viable, functioning production company, you need to have a good grip on what are the stories that people are interested in, who are the buyers in the market, what do they want to see, and how do they want to tell their story, and who's their audience, So you can't just go in with, here, this is important to me. I mean, people, they'll be nice, but they'll laugh you out of a room. Like, good for you. You should definitely go pay for that and go do it yourself. If you want to sell to HBO, or you want to sell to Discovery, or you want to sell to Peacock, you need to make a good, compelling argument about content that you have, a story you want to tell. And usually for documentaries and series, right, it's all about access. What do I have? What insight and what access do I have in this story that makes it worth doing? Who can I bring to the table? It can't just be my take on an issue that everybody else is covering. So, and then you have partnerships. So you constantly are saying, they'll call you up and say, hey, we're looking for this. Hey, we're looking for a game show. Hey, do you have anything in this space? We're looking for, a young person doing this kind of thing. And so you're just constantly, we have a great development team, but you really invest a lot in your development team, even though, you're not necessarily you're working all the time, but until you sell something, you're kind of just working without selling anything, and you have to figure out what are those things that really are going to hit.
So let's look forward a little bit. Years ago, you wrote the next big story. What are some of the biggest stories on the horizon that aren't getting the coverage they deserve?
Man, I think it's been interesting because I know a lot of ways, I think critical race theory has gotten too much coverage because it's not a thing. And I think that a lot of people covering some of these stories are very uneducated. I know when the New York Times did one of its first reporting on critical race theory, they quoted a lot of people. It would be like covering an issue and just quoting random people on it. Well, I know Einstein said E equals MC squared, but here's how I feel about it. Like, you just, and the same thing happened in critical race theory, like, angry mom quoted. I mean, it's so crazy. As opposed to it's an actual, graduate level course with reading and intellectual heft behind it. So I thought there was a lot of failure in that. And some of that was because you had people who were buying into this agenda, really a right-wing agenda of, making something, of selling it as a terrible thing, and that it even existed and was happening in schools, which we all know it's not. So I think I'm very interested in documentaries that talk about race and class and access. We did a story the other day for Matter of Fact that was just fascinating, that looked at a guy who's not Latino, who's from San Diego, and he's moved to Mexico and commutes to his job. He works full time, but he cannot afford housing in San Diego because the market is insane, as it is in many cities now. And so he commutes in from Mexico to his job in America. And he's American who is not fluent in Spanish every day. And so I have always found it very interesting to look at this kind of phenomenon, right? Understand what's happening in the country. And again, it's not a debate. We don't have him fighting anybody. We're kind of trying to understand the issues and what's happening to try to solve some of those challenges.
So before we run out of time, let's go back to the documentary Disrupt and Dismantle. And it actually also looked at a deep dive into structural racism. And that relates to both what you're talking about, CRT, and the day we're recording this is also part of the time when Judge Ketanji Jackson is being questioned.
Grilled,
I use the term loosely. Yes, I mean, there's other words.
She's doing such a great job. It's actually kind of funny.
Great job, but she's also being accused of being responsible for CRT. And so it's like, it's gotten so out of hand. And this also fits into, of course, the Black Lives Matter movement, which has been inspirational to the nation. And I just wonder if we're doing enough. Does it feel like social justice issues are only getting focused on in times of elections, and that we aren't continuing to do what we need to do? Is there something that we should be focusing on? What can we do?
Yeah, I think the narrative is very messy, right? And that is because there's an agenda behind it. You'll notice nobody cares about the caravan from Honduras the minute the midterms are over. And I just wish the New York Times sometimes would start recognizing that and understanding that the caravan, which is on the front page, happens every year and disappears, and it's not a big deal, but they just kind of buy into this rhetoric, which is disappointing. And the same thing with cancel culture, which I think is complete bullshit. And also this idea of, CRT, just ridiculousness. But media, right, kind of elevates these conversations, and I think that's been really problematic. Real racial justice, to me, is around hiring, housing, opportunities. And I think a lot of that work is being done in the courts, right? It's about really making sure we're challenging redlining. It's about really making sure that people who've committed to hire more people of color are actually doing that. I thought in the wake, a lot of the commitments in the wake of George Floyd, and some were complete BS, but a bunch of them were not. And a number of organizations who said that they wanted to diversify suddenly realized there were HBCUs or Latino serving organizations. And they're like, wow, you know what? If you would like to find some Latinos, maybe go there. They exist over there. And I think also just blunt conversations about what do we want our company to look like? What is our role in doing this? And I thought that was good. I mean, and I guess I never really think it's going to come from politicians. I always think it's going to come from organizations and people who want to try to figure it out and really provide solutions. I've seen some real change, and I've seen a lot of people try to hold themselves accountable to what they want to do. In our organization, I've been on enough shoots, and now when I go on a shoot, I'm like, we need to have 50% women and 50% people of color. I'm going to leave it up to whoever's booking and if you can't figure that out, we will just push the shoot down a little bit. And you know what? The minute you actually raise that, people are like, oh, okay. And that's it's the same thing as saying we need to have 3 cameras, or we need to have these kinds of lights, or you just say, if we're doing stories about a thing, like, this is what our company values are, and so if you would like me to work with you, here's what I need. And I have found nobody pushes back. People are like, okay, and we can be a 600-pound gorilla to make that happen, because those are my values, and if you want to work with me, then that's what we're going to see.
I agree. I just think we need to have more of a focus on it year round.
Yeah, 100%.
If we're talking about criminal justice reform in general, that's something that does take a lot of work of a lot of community groups, but it also takes the involvement of politicians, because they pass the laws that are going to ultimately make a difference. They fund in a way that makes a difference. So I'm hoping that we can do more.
You're 100% right.
Yeah.
100% right.
Yeah. Well, this has been such a fascinating conversation. Just one last question that we always love to end on. What is your advice to young people? I know we've talked a lot about career and what you've been through, but what is your parting advice for any young person, maybe those who are interested in becoming someone like you in journalism?
For me, I think it's always about, like, what do I do well and what do I need to work on? When I started reporting, and I was not good, I would have a list of 3 things. My husband actually was very helpful, and he would say, you just got to kind of go back to blocking and tackling. Like, I was so nervous during live shots, I couldn't remember. Generally it was 3 things. Soledad O'Brien, I'm standing live in front of the such and such. Later today, such and such. But up next, such and such, right? 3 sentences. Oh my God, I was a disaster. And his whole thing was like, stop overthinking it. Just, fall back to blocking and tackling. Just give us the basics, just until you get better. And I really think, so I kept a running list. What are the 3 things that I'm working on at any time? I would keep a little list with me. Like, these are the 3 things that I'm working on. And those things can be work skills. They can also be life skills, like show up on time, or remember to write thank you notes to people who do you a favor, or, double check your grammar when you're sending notes to your bosses because you look like an idiot when you have typos. And so I think it's really helpful to just constantly be working on yourself, not in a mean way, Nobody loves me more than me. I'm not, I don't think it's like self-bashing is not the way to do it. I think it's about, like, how do I improve? How do I take little steps to make myself better? And I have personally found, I'm a big list maker, but I personally found like a little running list of, I'm working on this. My live shots, I'm working on this. My life, I'm working on this. And then you get it, you cross it off, you put something else in its place, just your 3 things. I found that very helpful.
So I have a do it now folder. Which is, it's just labeled DIN, and I know it's the things that I have to get done in pretty fast order.
Yep.
And one of those is to ask you, so I'm known for my pins. I have a hashtag on Twitter.
Starfish, I loved it.
So did you notice mine for today?
Of course.
Okay, I just wanted to make sure because it was special.
I love
for
all
you.
your pins, which is why my mom would have loved you. My mom passed away a couple of years ago, but she would have loved you because she loved pins. Oops.
Me too. I've loved them since high school and will always wear them, but I was glad to find a starfish to wear for you today. Thank you so much for being with us today. I've enjoyed getting to know you a little better. I know our audience is going to love not only getting to know you, but watching some of the documentaries that you have made and will make as we go forward.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for doing that.
Yeah,
thank you for having me. Really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you. That was such a great conversation with Soledad. We hope you enjoyed it as much as we did. We'll be back next week with another episode of iGen Politics, wherever you follow your podcasts. So be sure to follow us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you follow your podcasts, and leave us a 5-star review and rating there. We're also on YouTube, so if you watch us on YouTube, subscribe there, like us there, and be sure to click on the bell for our weekly notifications.